Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Vintage Sci-Fi, where I take stories from across the last 100+ years and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called The Electric Shoes, written by J. Mac Richard. In 1920, the Brussels-Paris Express was entering the campaign station, the last stop before reaching Paris. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 passengers were seated in one of the first-class compartments, a gentleman of 40 who had got on at Turgnia, and your humble servant. We had exchanged some commonplace remarks. My companion spoke with an English accent. Scarcely had the train stopped when one of the doors was opened violently. A gust of wind blew in. My companion made a wry face, but the door remained open, held by someone on the outside. This impolite person was a young man with a military air. We supposed, at least, that he belonged to an army, since he had a cavalry sword strapped to his valise. The gentleman opposite me arose and slammed the door. The officer opened it again. Try as my companion could, he wasn't able to force it shut. "How ill-bred," he growled, as he returned to his seat. We heard an oath outside. The valise was pitched into a compartment, and the owner followed it. He was just in the nick of time. The engine whistle blew. The guard locked the door, and the train got under way. There was a tense silence presaging the violent outburst as the newcomer lifted his bag into the rack. I don't know what was passing in the gentleman's mind, but looking at his placid figure, one would have thought that he was not in the least affected by the young officer's nervous movements and bellicose attitude. "It seems to me," said the latter, looking at each of us in turn, "that I heard someone here use an expression ill-bred." "That word was used," answered my companion, unhesitantly. "To whom was it applied, may I ask?" "To you." Those last words had hardly been spoken when the officer's hand described a semicircle and struck the gentleman's face. I expected to see the latter spring on the shoulder. He did nothing of the sort. He made a slight movement with his left foot. It was almost imperceptible, but it produced an effect which made an ineffectual impression on me. Nobody could describe exactly the transformation which the officer underwent, but the vigorous, aggressive, quarrelsome man of a minute before became suddenly an automaton. Without power of resistance, without will, he was now being subjected to some mysterious torment, affected by some brain disturbance almost as violent as madness. His limbs jerked convulsively, his eyes almost started from their sockets, his teeth chattered, inarticulate sounds escaped from his throat. I felt sorry for him and got up to aid him, but the English gentleman motioned me away. With a smile on his lips, he ordered me to take my seat. "Don't be disturbed," he said in a friendly voice. "There isn't any danger. His suffering will stop whenever I want them to stop." "Mercy!" exclaimed the unfortunate young man, giving the Englishman a supplicating glance. The latter smiled sardonically. "Mercy!" the officer repeated. "Mercy!" "So be it," said the Englishman at last. "I pardon you, but don't start anything again with me." The mysterious traveller withdrew the foot which I had seen him press against the officer a few moments before. The officer fell back in his seat, put his head between his hands, and seemed completely prostrated. "Was it a dream, or was it real?" he murmured. "It was real enough," said the Englishman. "You will remember Sir John Maxton, I think, as long as you live." "I certainly will." "Well," continued Maxton, as he called himself, "I'm going to explain my system to you. Will you come a little closer, my dear sir," addressing me. "It's well worth your while." Maxton crossed his legs and showed us the tip of one of his shoes. "You see these 2 points?" he asked. "Yes. That is where my power comes from. Don't touch them. Ah! They are the extremities of an electric current fed by a battery concealed in the heel. The shocks which this gentleman felt were merely discharges produced by the connecting of 2 poles through the body. It is the greatest invention of our age, worth all of the Edisons. I have with me 2 similar pairs of shoes in this package. One was made for the King of the Belgians, and the other pair for the King of Italy. So our companion was only a common commercial traveller, but common isn't the right word. As we had just seen, he carried on his trade with the adroitness of an artist. "What do you charge for those shoes?" I asked, still marvelling at the demonstration he had given us. 200 francs. That's hardly anything." "It's cheap enough," said the officer. "But why couldn't I buy a pair ahead of the King of the Belgians?" "And why couldn't I buy a pair," I said, "ahead of the King of Italy?" "Well, I don't see why you can't," replied Sir John Nexton, "on condition, of course, that you don't make any use of them for several days. I want to have a chance to offer these crowned heads a real novelty." When we arrived in Paris, the officer and I each possessed a pair of electric shoes. We took leave of Sir John Nexton. I was walking home with my precious package under my arm when a carriage passed me in the Rue Verona, and I heard voices which seemed familiar. I recognized the officer and the Englishman. They were sitting close together and laughing boisterously. That aroused my suspicions. At my hotel, I put on a pair of shoes intended for the King of Italy and hurried down to the dinner table. I touched several people with my toe, but none of them showed any signs of electric shock. They merely seemed annoyed at my awkwardness. I had to admit to myself that my famous shoes were no more electric than any other shoes. I had been a victim of a comedy played by two clever conspirators. My first impulse was to make a complaint to the police. But since the story would certainly have raised a laugh at my expense, I thought wiser to say nothing. End of story.